Welcome to Global Affairs Unfiltered, and welcome to K-Talk Radio. I think, whoops. Chunk. All right, we got that taken care of. All right, here we go. Welcome, everybody, at K-Talk, as well as, well, wait a second. Yeah, brother. Hold on a second. Nobody's on the stream. That makes it easier. All right, so, and I'm not at K-Talk either. What do you know about that? Let's turn that off. Let's see if that'll help any, and then turn it back on again. See if that'll make any difference to the recording. Nope. Ah, well, I should have known. For Pete's sake. All right, whoever's tuning into the stream, sorry. The radio station isn't working on again. All right. Well, I've got a lot of good things to cover today. Well, just jumping all over the planet. The kinds of things that are taking place. Every time we turn around, there's another earthquake. I'm going to cover the Alawite genocide, and I'm going to cover the Palestinian genocide, and I'm going to cover the Ukrainian genocide. As well as some things that are leaking around out there that might indicate a possible new future for the planet. Where there is some hope as to what's taking place out there. All right, I'm not going to worry about this anymore. If Paul can help me tune into the radio station, that would be all well and good. Unless maybe I got to call into Zara or what in? Oh, well, Paul is answering me. I'm sorry, the one person who's on the stream there, dead air. Yeah. Yeah, I know. So, what are we going to do about it? This is just unacceptable. I'm sorry. So I'll disconnect that and that. Let's see if he's going to do something. All right, Paul's going to take a look. All right, for those of you who are on the stream, welcome. Glad to have you here. As I started the program, I mean, we're truly in a dramatic turmoil around this planet right now, where almost every day you've got some new political seismic activity taking place. It's not clear yet where this is going to go, but it's certainly not without attention-grabbing headlines. And while the situation around the Ukraine has been in the forefront for the last week, especially after Zelenski's dramatic appearance in the White House last Friday, I think it was, things are really going to go completely, not this Friday, but the Friday before. No, this last Friday. Was it this last Friday? Whatever. Things are going to, looks like they're going to go completely haywire here for long. The European reaction to President Trump's insistence that he wants to bring the Ukraine war to an end is an amazing one. I mean, how Europe is responding to this. There was a couple of days ago a special European Union Council meeting where Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, announced that they approved 800 billion euro, 800 billion euro for something called the Rearm Europe plan. And this is supposed to be voted on at the next formal European Council meeting on the 21st of March, which is an enormous sum of money, 800 billion euros to rearm Europe. On the verge of Trump pulling the U.S. out of NATO, on the verge of following the Russian demands, not for a ceasefire, for the end of the war and what Russia expects. And since Russia has won the war, it's not like they're going to sit there and play cards and negotiate and make some kind of, all right, we'll give this up if you'll give that up kind of a thing. So with that, I mean, if that's not enough, in the meantime, the designated new chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, managed in 1 week, just 1 week. I mean, just like some of our American presidents in the past, to make a 180-degree reversal, because before he was elected, he promised and told the voters many times that the CDU, the Christian or the conservative arm of the parliament, would be against the change in the so-called debt brake. And the debt brake is a mechanism whereby it's written into the German constitution that the government cannot bypass a certain limit in terms of new credits. And he said that because there are extraordinary circumstances, that has to be abandoned. Just 1 week after being elected, on the promise that he would not go past the debt brake. Therefore, he's now proposing a military budget of 400 billion euros, in addition to 500 billion euros in infrastructure, but that the 400 billion is not a cap. He said it'll do whatever it takes, and this is obvious reference to the famous remarks by Mario Draghi. All right, hold on a second here. Let me answer this. All right, now let me see if I am in fact recording, because I have to be able to do that. So let's go from here and see if I am in fact coming across. And I am not. You can hear? It's not showing any recording. So today's show won't be recorded. Good. I didn't want to anyway. All right. If you can hear me, that means that I am broadcasting K-Talk, as well as, hey, and it's only 9 minutes after the hour, new world's record. So back to what I'm saying here about Merz. And this is why, I mean, this guy just won the election. He just won the election by 10% more than the alternate party. And on the promise that he wouldn't bankrupt German economy, now he's said, well, things have happened. Things have happened, things have occurred. We don't have any choice. We got to go back on what we said. Even the Bild Zeitung, which is the largest tabloid in Germany, had on whole pages of quotes from people expressing the fact that they felt betrayed by Merz already. 1 week into his elected office, being betrayed. And what's the pretext for all of this? Well, obviously the reaction to the fast sequence of events. First the speech by Hegseth, a month ago in Brussels. And then the speech by Vice President Vance at the Munich Security Conference. Then I think that was followed, where he was accusing Europe of not having any free speech. That's what it was. and that the real enemies of the war were the government leaders themselves. Then followed by the meeting of Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary of State Rubio in Riyadh, and then the discussion on the phone between Putin and Trump, and then topping it all off, the freak out in the Oval Office with Zelenski, where he gets in the shouting match with Trump and Vance and was unceremoniously kicked out of the White House, as he should have been. And this is now followed by a whole bunch of events. Zelensky immediately went from the White House to London, and I talked about this last week, where he was received with open arms by Keir Starmer, calming his tears, and Macron was threatening to send French troops into the Ukraine to open the French nuclear umbrella to all of Europe. And I'm going to talk about this more here in a few moments, because you want to remember, the British cannot use their nukes without American support. They need American technology to use their nukes, but the French are free of that. And Macron comes out and makes this crazy statement that he wants to make French nuclear arms available to all of Europe. Wow. And this, of course, was immediately answered by Foreign Minister Lavrov, who said that the proposals of Macron to send troops into the Ukraine are absolutely unacceptable, and it would be the direct deployment of NATO against Russia, and obviously there would be appropriate consequences if France were to do something like this. So all this stuff is kind of setting the stage. I mean, obviously the Europeans are so dead set on their entire strategy of ruining Russia and of causing strategic defeat for Russia, which has been the litany of the last 3 years, that they cannot adjust themselves to the idea that Trump would say something like, why don't we just end this war with an agreement with Russia? So obviously the Europeans at no point made any effort to solve this conflict through diplomacy, and at no point did they ever propose to negotiate anything. They were always talking about how Ukraine has to win on the battlefield and how Russia has to be defeated. And that's their only mantra. And now that they're confronted with this action by Trump, which is not yet settled, but it's in the first baby steps of negotiation as it is, naturally many things have followed. And Trump has stopped sending military equipment to the Ukraine. May only be a pause, but cutting Ukraine off from military intelligence. We're not going to let you have access to our satellite information anymore. And somebody said this is like using a 2x4 against a mule just to get its attention. But that's what's happened. And there are threats that the United States may cut off their intelligence sharing with the British and the Five Eyes, which has created this completely new situation, because the entire nuclear arsenal, as I said, of the British is only operational with U.S. technological support and intelligence support. And the Brits cannot use their nukes independently of the United States intelligence. And it's only the French nuclear arsenal which has sovereign or independent ability to function. And what this whole thing has caused is this absolutely unprecedented and, on the surface, almost non-understandable reaction by the Europeans. They're saying that this is a complete severing of the Western alliance. And now Europe is on its own and has to go for its own defense and can't rely on the United States any longer. It's like a complete break. So Merz comes out and reverses his election promise of a cap on defense spending, and now says, nope, there's no cap. We got to immediately arm Germany. And at the European summit in London, while running around like a chicken without a head, they realized that the European Union plus the British are not militarily fit to be on their own without NATO. And obviously the fact that they are still in NATO means even the French cannot freely use their nuclear arsenal without the permission of the NATO structure in general. So there's all these reports coming out. For example, from the Keeler, K-E-E-L-E-R, you can look this up, Keeler Economic Institute, which say that the condition of the German army is absolutely ludicrous. They say to get back to the level of the Bundeswehr, Not on the tower, not only live streaming. I don't know, maybe somebody turned the radio off last night. That often will happen. Well, I don't know what else to do, Paul. I hope you're on the stream. You can keep me tuned in, but I cannot contact the radio station. Oh boy, which kind of, oh, excuse me for a moment. All right. Paul, I'm just going to leave you here on my phone. If you can, we can try from the Zara. All right, you want to try from the Zara computer? Waiting to hear something. What is this? All right, let's see if you can get something from the Zara computer. So back to what I was talking about how long that it would take all right. Hold on a second here. Let me get in here. I don't know where that's coming from. Coming from the transmitter. Ka-chunk. This is embarrassing, to say the least. I thought I had a pretty good show here I could do for you. Still nothing coming through. Oh. Well, we simulcasting because I can hear something on the phone, but I see me coming across the recording computer. This is so screwed up. I'm sorry, everybody. Now, if I'm sharing this with somebody else, all right, I'm on, but I hear something on the phone. All right. I'm just going to continue where I was. See if anybody's left on the stream. This, if they want to finance this kind of rearmament on the European and German levels of their military, it's going to take years and years and years. One source I looked at said that they say to get back to the level of the German army as it existed in 2004, to get that same number of fighter jets, you need from now on at least 15 years to do so. To get back to the level of tanks from 2004, you need 40 years. And to have the same amount of howitzers that the German army had in 2004, you would need 100 years. So obviously this is a moot question, so why? Thanks, Paul, I know you have. I appreciate that. They say to get back to the level, so why are they going for this expansive military armament program with the figures that I just mentioned a few minutes ago? I mean, obviously, one has to say, and if they want now to finance that kind of military, shoot, really? they want that kind of military rearmament on the European and German level. It's up to these other countries. I mean, they can't be financed without that kind of budget. Therefore, they want to create this separate mechanism, and this is, which is a historic precedent in the MIFO bills of Hjalmar Schacht, who financed the Nazis. And that's how Schacht managed to get the armament industry going again in the late 20s, early 30s in Germany. And now there's all these articles starting to show up in the British press which say how this is how the United States got out of the Depression. It was not the New Deal, it was war mobilization, which is a very common story. But what these people leave out is the logical outcome of this bill, this kind of mobilization, was to go to war, because you cannot realize the bubble in actual physical economic terms unless you go for complete destruction in the war. And that's what is looming, and that's the danger here, despite Trump's efforts to try to quell this battle where it is now. And if this continues, you're only going to have a complete catastrophe. And that is not uniform approval by the Europeans at all, because within the different countries, many people are waking up to the enormity of what is happening. And it's not 100% clear that the new coalition that MERS has created, because some people in the social democracy have a very big stomach ache about this kind of rearmament. Even some of the people, leaders in MERS's own party, are very, very critical. But naturally, in the European community, Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, was the only one who voted against this, utilizing his veto against such a plan. And he said this by far goes beyond the means of the European Union to do this. And I think this is something the world has to take into consideration as a strategic cause for alarm of the highest priority, because the historic precedent is Hjalmar Schacht. And people should look at history to recognize what the outcome of such a war mobilization led to. And the reason's obvious. The European establishment is so freaked out about Trump because he represents a discontinuity to the previous imperial policies. And since they have not yet reviewed the fact as to why Trump was elected, which is because the American voters rejected the policies which went along with this unipolar world domination, the globalization, all of its aspects. And if the Europeans would be smart, which they obviously are very far away from being, they would reflect on the fact that Trump got elected because of the policies of the previous administration, especially Obama, and then the Biden continuity. And rather than drawing the conclusion that if they don't shape up and correct their policy failures, they can maybe hold on to power for a very short period of time, but it will for sure fuel similar opposition in all the European communities, not just Hungary. So in a completely short-sighted, stupid reaction, but it represents the fact that these policy elites in Europe are not willing and not capable of reflecting on the policy failure of the last 35 years following the end of the Cold War, and the attempt to establish a unipolar world with all its predicates that implied with that. So this means there's a very dramatic situation going on in Europe right now. Not to say it's not equally severe and dramatic, to mention what's going on in the Middle East. There was a very important summit in Cairo here a week ago where a Gaza reconstruction plan was decided on. Egypt now has committed itself to organize a large all-Arab conference for the realization of this plan. But that's just a baby step in the direction of the Oasis plan. But on Gaza itself, it looks very dire, because now for the sixth day, seventh day, the IDF is again blockading Gaza, not letting in food, humanitarian aid, other kinds of equipment, and now they just turn the electricity off. This is once again leading to enormous war crimes and crimes against humanity. That was just stated recently by a UN official in the situation, but this security architecture that's being recommended by China, Putin in his 27th of February discussion with his own government said that he now sees the potential for a European security, even global security system. I mean, these options are out there on the horizon, being offered to the very same people who said that Russia must be destroyed. And so the Vatican representative to the United Nations has again made a dramatic appeal to the world community to cease this warmongering, warning of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and appealing to a world to go into a different direction. One would wish that especially these parties that have a C in their names, like the Christian Democrats, the CDU party of Germany that just won, might exercise a little Christianity. But as the various intelligence estimates from Sweden, Denmark, Holland, Germany somehow out of the blue made up this figure of all these billions of euros by saying that Russia is going to be ready by 2029 or 2030 to have another major war on a country in Europe or maybe all of Europe. There is not one iota of proof for that. And it's assumption to motivate the present rearmament policies. And if you look objectively at the policies of Russia, I've not seen proof by anybody, any inclination whatsoever why it would be in Russia's interest to go on a path to prepare for war for 2029 or 2030. It's just a complete lie. And I think it's important that, you look at former members of the intelligence services, like you can do a great favor to the world and the prospect of peace by analyzing it, but, is there any proof that Russia has such plans? Likewise, the accusation that China is trying to replace the United States as an imperial power. There's no proof of that whatsoever. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the Chinese government, the Chinese system, it's completely different from the Western system. That's true. They say they're communists. One can say it's a very specific communism with Chinese characteristics, but it's much more 5,000 years of Chinese tradition, which has always been devoted to the common good, more so than individual freedom. And many features of what is being blasted now by the West as being so horrible are simply Chinese culture, a culture which has served them very well. Why do you think that it is Asia that is absolutely thriving right now and the West is dying, collapsing? At least the European part of the West is in free fall. And I think we've reached a point where we absolutely have to review what in the thinking of the West is still colonial. Now, the fact that the British role in the instigation of this war, this European war, this Ukrainian war, is absolutely undebatable. Boris Johnson ruining the Istanbul Agreement, Starmer egging on Trump to send more weapons and further reaching weapons. The role of the British is without any question for anybody who wants to see what is going on. And now Macron's offering the nuclear umbrella for all of Europe, which would not be a good idea. Also the idea of French troops into the Ukraine. Isn't it amazing that the former colonial powers of the Sykes-Picot Treaty that set up the Middle East as it is are now the major ones instigating the Ukrainian war? Well, there is clearly a remnant of colonialism in the policies of these Europeans. So, are there bigger forces behind this? One would want to blame things on the military-industrial complex. If you look at how the European system has evolved, especially in the case of Germany, it's the most obvious that the entire existence of post-war Germany has been as an occupied country. Sovereignty has not yet been accomplished. The 2+4 agreement after the unification theoretically or practically gave sovereignty to Germany, but was never accomplished. The whole structure of how the parliament was taken over, how people were put in by the West according to the checkbook, according to money, sort of blueprint which happened to West Germany after Second World War by the occupying power. And they put in selected politicians who they had chosen in exile according to the best fitting profile, the interest of the occupying powers, which was to completely take over German industry. And not take over German industry in order to build it up better, but to essentially dismantle it. And the whole structure is that such people who go along with this program end up making careers, and those who deviate do not. And the only breaks with that are obviously the alternative party and the BSW that was kicked out of the parliament. And there's a real problem with the parliamentary system of Europe anyway. It really has denigrated, almost like the U.S. election. It's almost as bad as the U.S. election process that we have, which has become to a very large extent simply a plutocracy. Wall Street money, the military-industrial complex money, was really enabling a lot of careers of congressmen and senators in the United States. Likewise, who is being put up in the parliamentarian party system of Europe is very much the same question. Are they fitting the profile of the interests of the oligarchy? That's a very, very big problem. That means that a lot of people who would otherwise act differently want to not lose their privileges, and therefore they just go along. And they do what they are asked to do by these sinister forces. That's the system. That's the system of oligarchy. You don't have to put people on a payroll necessarily. It's just being a part of the club to go along to get along. And naturally, you know, you have to have some people who are both clearly what the British Integrity Initiative used to call cluster agents, and people who are put into various positions to radiate the story throughout their dominions. And they're very obvious because they're very outspoken and clear, but some of these people are in it to the point where they become their own drivers. And democracy goes out the window, statecraft goes out the window. You know, people who try to become competent, especially in the German government, who could be a chancellor, an economic minister, education minister, cultural minister. It just goes against the same thing that we've had here in this country for so long, the laziness of people who would rather have the worst of government mediocrity that the government can provide, rather than having to think on their own. And so there's this huge crisis that exists in the West, especially here in America, where people simply aren't trying to improve themselves anymore. And I think it has remnants to the end of the Roman Empire. But so moving on here, when you look at the horrible events going on in Gaza and the West Bank and so forth, so many times it's important for people to organize around that perspective, but it's only if you have a vision for a better future that you overcome the cycle of violence. It's not just, you don't just go in and blow the whistle and tell everybody to get out of the pool and go home. You've got to have a better system to follow. And I believe it will only be possible because you have a conjunction where the United States and Russia and China, these nations agree on something which goes in the direction of a new security and development architecture, which is what China is developing. Because only if you stop geopolitics, because the entire Middle East is just a proxy war for the colonial powers, including the United States, and only if these powers stop their geopolitical games and allow a system where every country on the planet has its interests realized, will you ever have any kind of a solution. So I've got more I can go into on that, but I want to move to some other ideas, some other things that are going on. I might come back to that, but Uh, I mean, it's almost daily that these historic events are unfolding, underlining the dramatic nature of this historic process that's currently underway in every corner of this planet. Then, larger than the new Trump administration here, the scale of this process encompasses a historic change that spans at least the last 500 years of colonialism and neo-colonialism. Even if a lot of the shifts have been set in motion in just the last 30 plus days that Trump's been in office. In the Ukraine, the Western-backed proxy war against Russia appears to be on its last legs. The Russian troops have ostensibly maneuvered behind Ukraine's front lines in Kursk, the territory Ukraine seized from Russia last August, in this futile bid to distract from its losses in Eastern Europe, making the beginning of the end for the Ukrainian troops in that region. Reports indicate that Ukrainian troops are losing ground by the hour and will likely be entirely run out of Russia's Kursk region very soon, which is occurring on the eve of Zelenski's trip back to Washington, along with his enablers from the UK and France. And this loss would mean Ukraine's position in any potential peace negotiations would be even worse than it is currently, and further underscores the abject failure of the West's efforts to weaken Russia. Had they gone through with the peace agreement that was proposed in February or March of 2022, 3 years ago, Ukraine would have been left largely intact, a few concessions here and there. Now, and the Russians aren't going to sit there and say, well, if you do this, we'll do that. If you do that, we'll do this. That isn't going to happen. The Russians are going to say, especially in that meeting tomorrow, the Russians are going to say, well, here's what is. And you can join with us and help celebrate the end of this war with this is what is. We are holding all the ground that we've taken. We are definitely going to be holding the Crimea. We want Kharkov, we want Odessa, but since we don't occupy it, maybe not. There will be no peacekeeping force. Ukraine will demilitarize and denazify and rewrite their constitution so that Ukraine can never become a member of NATO. These are not debatable points. This is the way it's going to be, or we'll move on to Kyiv. It's really silly, almost infantile, to expect a conquering army to back up and say, well, okay, we'll give you back half of what we took. Another area that is expressed in this is in Syria, where this large-scale fighting has erupted over these previous days. Reports are now coming in that the civilian fatalities number in the hundreds, maybe even far higher, with the Christians, the Alawites, the Druze, the Syrian minorities are being targeted for elimination by Syria's al-Qaeda regime. And as the LaRouche organization for more than a decade warned that the attempt to topple the government of Bashar al-Assad since the Obama administration would, if successful, lead to mass death throughout Syria and beyond. And it appears that we are now witnessing the tragic result of the failure to abandon that policy sooner. But perhaps the most glaring manifestation of the collapse of today's oligarchical rules-based order is the events unfolding in Europe. As I was going through there for a few minutes, rather than accepting a peaceful settlement in the Ukraine and a future relationship with Russia, the European leaders are hell-bent on escalating even further in their obsession against Russia. As I said at the beginning of the program, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen wants to invest $800 billion euros to rearm Europe. Germany's expected, well, Merz has already says he wants 400 billion for arms and 500 billion for infrastructure, which will largely be military infrastructure. And I think if Europe continues to chart a war path and oppose Trump's moves towards peace with Russia, Europe will be making a catastrophical, historical mistake. Because if they attempt to finance the enormous lack of military capabilities by creating money outside their regular budget, as I said, they're repeating what Hjalmar Schacht did. And at that point, the Great War with Russia, with all the countries with what Russia is a strategic partnership, would simply become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the events of today absolutely screaming out for a new system. And while the Trump administration has shown some hopeful signs in this direction, much remains to be seen as whether it can consciously act on such a set of new axioms to guide its policies, or fall into the back into the quicksand of chaos. I mean, the report of the direct U.S.-Hamas negotiations behind the back of Israel offers some more hopeful indication that statecraft and diplomacy are being rediscovered by the West. So, you know, the tensions between the Syrian government and the minority factions have escalated quite a bit in recent days, and unfortunately is now leading to the large-scale massacre of citizens. And the reports vary, but this is a snapshot of what we know so far, that violence began last Thursday in the coastal village of Latakia, where gunmen had attacked a Syrian police patrol, killing 13. And then the tensions had been mounting in the region between the terrorist Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, the regime of Ahmed Hussein al-Sharaa, and the remnants of the former President Assad's minority Alawite sect. Another ambush in the nearby town of Jableh killed at least 16 Assad loyalists, and violence also occurred in Tartus. These are towns on the northwest coast of Syria, about 100 miles northwest of Damascus. And HTS, of course, is just an offshoot of al-Qaeda, but was conveniently allowed to flourish over the last decade by the United States. The United States continued to fund, arm, support al-Qaeda in the U.S. efforts to oust Assad. So the state Syrian Arab News Agency reported that large reinforcements were being sent to the coastal region to get the situation under control, but instead violence escalated against the minority populations. The Syrian Observatory newspaper said that helicopter gunships took part in attacking the Alawite gunmen in Jableh and nearby areas, and it added that fighters that were loyal to former Syrian Army Major General al-Hassan, whose unit was known as the Tiger Forces, took part in the attacks against security forces, and Hassan is an Alawite and was an ally of Assad, and his current whereabouts are unconfirmed, which has resulted in revenge killings by the HTS forces. Figures range from 700, several hundred to several thousands, including women and children, especially Alawites, Christians, and the other minorities. And the various news agencies report that civilians are being gunned down in cold blood. Now, the former Greek Prime Minister Antonis Samaras took to X to blast the Western nations for cozying up to these barbaric forces, which he claimed are run by the Turkish regime. He said this: "What is happening in Syria is neo-Ottoman inspired and is being implemented by the terrorists of Ahmad al-Sharaa, who did not change just because he simply put on a tie." However, the EU and the West ought to know that when you replace evil with evil, the authoritarian leader with a leading member of al-Qaeda acting on Erdogan bidding, then you inevitably lead up to massacres of thousands of civilians and scenes of barbarism that he says humanity cannot bear in the 21st century. So he called on the EU to immediately condemn the massacres and begin imposing sanctions against all of the al-Sharaa regime. So where are we in this? Well, Secretary of State Rubio issued a statement in defense of the ethnic minorities in Syria. He said this: "The United States condemns the radical Islamist terrorists, including foreign jihadis, that murdered people in western Syria in recent days. The United States stands with Syria's religious and ethnic minorities, including its Christian, Druze, Alawite, and Kurdish communities, and offers its condolences to the victims and their families. Syria's interim authorities must hold the perpetrators of these massacres against Syria's minority communities accountable." And some reports are saying that al-Sharaa has appealed to the population for calm and restraint, however, showing his true colors. The HTS leader, al-Jilani, has instructed militants to stop recording their acts of violence in a clear effort to control the narrative and minimize the damage to his public image. Stop filming those atrocities. Are you crazy? Now that Macron has offered, how much longer is he going to be in power? Now that Macron has offered to share France's nuclear umbrella to a European umbrella, the French political party Solidarité and Progress published the following call written by sovereigntists representing the best of our defense commitments. And it is signed by a whole mess of military people, and that's who this is coming from. And it's just, Macron says he's open, as I said, to a European nuclear deterrent, in a very stark contrast to decades of French independence on the subject. He said, but this is what this article is saying. Nuclear weapons are not more powerful than any other weapon. They are the ultimate weapon for defending a nation whose very existence outside any conventional battlefield must deter any potential enemy from attacking it, for fear of the terrible, unbearable reprisals that such entail for the attacker. This is the fundamental principle of nuclear deterrence, conceived by the French strategist Generals Gallois and Allaire and others, and envisaged by General de Gaulle as early as the end of the Second World War. And it's the weapon that makes us invulnerable to preserve peace through fear of employment. We haven't finished with the atomic bomb, the most powerful means of warfare against by bringing peace. A strange peace, but peace all the same. Wait for it. And it goes on, where all of these French military people have just come down on Macron as being absolutely insane. That he wants to be able to use French nuclear weapons as a defensive measure for all of Europe. Against Russia, I don't think they're defending themselves against Thailand or New Zealand. This is just, it's when you look at what President Trump did the other night, Tuesday, with his essential State of the Union. And there were many things that he said that the Democrats should have applauded, because they're nonpartisan issues. And when he was pointing out people in the gallery, just human decency would require compliance on the part of the Democrats. And when he walked in, what is normally done when the president walks into a room is that people stand up. Not for Trump, but for the office of the presidency of the United States, out of respect. They didn't even do that, showing no respect for the office of the presidency. My point in bringing this up is this: I see the same attitude in the Western European leadership. Anything that they can do or say that is contrary to common sense, they seem to feed on and thrive on. Just like there were certain things backed by the principle of common sense the Democrats should have either stood up for or at least applauded in some of the things the president said that benefited all Americans, not just those who voted for him. Which brings up an idea that I was reading in the press that, and this is an article by John Levine in the New York Post over the weekend, that some members of our elected government have mental faculties so diminished that they can no longer do their jobs. And there are others who have been reported voting drunk, voting when they're high, as they show up in Congress to give their vote. Now, up to a dozen members of Congress reportedly have mental faculties so diminished that they can no longer do their jobs, with some even, as I said, showing up drunk or stoned to cast their votes. I kind of wonder if this may be the same situation with European leaders. Now, Representative Jim Hines, a Democrat from Connecticut, said to Politico, "There's no question that somewhere between 6 and a dozen of my colleagues are at a point where I think they don't have the faculties to do their job," which spoke to about 25 members of the House and Senate who spilled the tea on their unnamed colleagues. And a Republican colleague concurred with an important addendum, who said this: "I have a difficult time sometimes telling between the deterioration of members and a handful who are just not very smart." Can you believe that? That some of the voting that takes place in Congress isn't just because they're a member of a particular party that doesn't like something, but that they might actually be stupid. After President Biden's 2024 campaign spectacular collapse to his age-related cognitive issues, the issue of elected officials hanging on their past best used by date has come sharply into focus, with neither chamber of Congress being spared. Former California Senator Dianne Feinstein held office despite being so diminished she was forced to cede power of attorney to her daughter. And then Texas Representative Kay Granger, the former powerful chair of the House Appropriations Committee, was found in an assisted living facility last year after being AWOL for 6 months. Representative Richie Torres, Democrat from New York, said, "The United States Congress is the world's most prestigious senior center." And some lawmakers claim that late-night votes in the House are rarely cast entirely sober. He said this: "Every time we do an 11 p.m. vote, a minority of the chamber has 0 blood alcohol content. Now that's different than voting drunk. He said, I don't think I've ever seen somebody demonstrably drunk on the floor, but several have showed up drunk several times, and that there was one or two Democrats I thought might be high or something, but not necessarily drunk. Now, this is from a Democrat from Virginia. And then Representative Nicole Maliotakis, a Republican from New York, said, I would say that D.C. is more like Veep, the TV series. She said, we've had a couple of Veep moments in my office. Other members have cried poverty about their $174,000 salary, something which has not been adjusted for inflation in 15 years. James Clyburn, the famous South Carolina rep, one of the most powerful Democrats in the chamber, said this: I have people who land in the airport here and they call me and ask, can I send my car for them? I mean, my first term here, I didn't even have a car. And then Himes, as I quoted earlier, everybody thinks that we fly around on Air Force One and dine at the French embassy every night. But the reality is I'm eating burritos and McDonald's more often than I'm dining in any embassy. I wanted to throw this in. I just thought this was hilarious. It just may be, this idea or this designation of Congress as being a senior center. Age-related cognitive issues. And some of them who show up late at night for an 11 o'clock p.m. vote are drunk or high. As is, I suppose, the opportunities that are given them during the break, during the lunch break. So direct talks, that was a little aside there. I just thought it was hilarious. The direct talks between the U.S. and Hamas confirm now that Hamas notes the important role of Witkoff. I thought this was interesting. Hamas enjoys the important role that Witkoff is offering. So Tahir al-Nono, an Hamas political advisor, telling Reuters that the group has engaged in direct talks with U.S. officials in Qatar over the recent days. Of course, this has got Israel tied up in knots. He said this, Al-Nono said, several meetings have already taken place in Doha, focusing on releasing one of the dual nationality prisoners. We have dealt positively and flexibly in a way that serves the interests of the Palestinian people. Now, the prisoner in question is Eden Alexander, the 21-year-old from New Jersey who was serving in the IDF at the time of his capture by Hamas. He is believed to be the last living American citizen held hostage, and Witkoff told the reporters last week that Alexander's release is a top priority for us. Here you have an American, natural-born American, picked up by Hamas during that raid, wearing an IDF uniform. Now, he's lucky he wasn't shot. We informed the American delegation that we don't oppose the release of the prisoner within the framework of these talks. In addition, Al-Nono, again, who is the Hamas political advisor, noted the important role played by Witkoff in reaching the January 19th ceasefire agreement, said, we hope that he, Witkoff, will work to succeed in the negotiation of a second phase. And it appears that Israel has had no involvement in these talks. A fact that the Times of Israel noted in their coverage just yesterday morning. They said this: Israel has been angered by the reports that the U.S. met separately with Hamas and offered concessions without getting consent from Jerusalem. Excuse me, I just, under an open window last night. So Adam Baylor, the U.S. Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs, was represented in the U.S. in talks with Al-Nono, spoke to Fox News yesterday, said the talks are very productive, and regarding Hamas, he said Hamas did orient toward a long-term truce, that would see it disarmed and excluded from political policy, where it would be disarmed but not be part of the political policy. Boy. Well, that's set off panic in Israel, as you might understand. On the one hand, it looks like Trump's doing everything he can, bending over backwards to give Netanyahu everything he wants, including 1,800, 2,000-pound bombs. Only don't use them, he said. And at the same time, Witkoff, Trump's right-hand man for these negotiations, is meeting with Hamas outside of the jurisdiction of the IDF and Netanyahu. So reports of these secret negotiations in Doha has absolutely enraged Israel. And when asked about Israel's frustration during the Sunday talk shows, Representative Adam Baylor told CNN that he was sympathetic to Israel's concerns, but we are the United States, and we are not an agent of Israel, which would come as a shock to anybody who's actually studied this stuff to believe that. So according to the Daily Haaretz, which is probably the most left-leaning publication in Israel, Baylor was optimistic about a deal with Hamas, saying something can come together within weeks, that there's a real chance for some real movement. So in comments to Fox News Today yesterday, Baylor said, referring to his discussion with the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, quite frankly, it's totally fair for Israel to have concerns about direct contact. I think I was able to put him at ease, but that I wasn't going off the rails, and that it would be parameters that we would work on together. So the move has sidelined Netanyahu, who was insisting no deal could ever be made with Hamas, as an excuse, of course, to restart the fighting. Now there's reports that Netanyahu may be forced to move toward the second stage of the ceasefire deal, which he, of course, as you well know, has so far resisted vigorously. Now, tomorrow, Witkoff will be traveling to Qatar for ceasefire negotiations. So the U.S. is moving ahead anyway with what the U.S. thinks needs to be done. Now, to the north, this is kind of interesting. Mark Carney, the electronic vote by thousands of Liberal Party members across Canada yesterday, elected Mark Carney as the new head of the Liberal Party. And whereas the vote was viewed by Canadian pundits as the result of the unusual series of events that have unfolded over the last few months in Ottawa, it would be more exact to view the crowning of Mark Carney, who back in 2012 was named by Euro Money magazine as the central bank governor of the year. So that's who you're getting as the new Premier of Canada, a central bank governor. So, I mean, it's a clear attempt by, obviously, the transatlantic financial elites to counter the tectonic shifts that are being brought by the BRICS nations and the Global South's march towards a new economic world order by putting in place a global financial dictatorship aided by Mark Carney in Canada and BlackRock's MERS in Germany and other elected and non-elected officials such as the Eurocrats in Brussels. So the Carney campaign has essentially was leaked to the Globe and Mail, a mouthpiece of in Canada of the city in the city of London, the following schedule of events for this week. After Prime Minister Justin Trudeau visits the Governor General of Canada, Mary Simon, early this week to tender his resignation as Prime Minister, he will ask the Honourable Mary Simon to dissolve Parliament. That you imagine that? If we had a change of presidency midterm and part of it was to dissolve Congress. I don't know if that's a plus or a minus for parliamentary government, But on Wednesday, the day after tomorrow, Carney will be sworn in as Prime Minister of Canada in the presence of the Governor General. This is from the Canadian press. Mr. Carney is expected to formally sit down with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on Monday, today, to discuss the transition to power that will likely see him and a new slimmed-down cabinet sworn in by Friday at the latest. He is also expected to join Mr. Trudeau at the final Liberal caucus meeting Monday. Over the past week, Mr. Carney has focused on issues including staffing the Prime Minister's office, cabinet selection, transition to government, recruitment of star candidates, and drafting an election platform to take to Canadian voters. A fourth source said former Privy Council clerk Janice Charette is heading to the transition team, which will focus on the size of the blah, 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 blah. Nothing in there about becoming the 51st state. It's hilarious. Just the most important line that I was quoting there from the Canadian press is the fact that this is an attempt by the Atlanticists, the City of London, Wall Street, Washington, to maintain their strict, powerful position that they imagine themselves to be in against BRICS and the emerging global south that is becoming more and more of a power with BRICS. So they put in somebody that was nominated in 2012 by Euromoney magazine as the Central Bank Governor of the Year. So what is his leaning going to be? What is the motivation behind Carney as the new Premier of Canada? I only fear for the Canadians, especially those in Alberta and southern British Columbia. All right, now we have, I was going to mention this, just a shortage that just showed up. We have a massive shortage of hospital beds. The American Medical Association's JAMA Network report, published a month ago, February 19th, warns that demand for hospital beds will continue to increase in the U.S. It's not so much the hospital beds, it's the reason why that I want to mention here, leading to a dangerous threshold by 2032. The researchers warn that by 2032, national hospital occupancy is expected to exceed 85%. Now, in an apartment building complex, by contrast here, in an apartment building complex where they have, let's say they've got 250 renters, they want 95 to 98% occupancy. That way it's making money, it's paying its mortgage, it's making money for the investors, but they want at least a 95 to 98% occupancy. They want a few empty rooms because there's always a turnover. And they don't want the reputation on the street that they're completely loaded and don't bother talking to us, because they're never completely loaded because there's always turnover. But to have a 95 to 98% occupancy is pretty good. Now, what they're warning in the United States by 2032, which is just 7 years from now, hospital occupancy will exceed 85%. And I'm quoting here from the JAMA report, when basic hospital operations can become dysfunctional and even unsafe. Now, what do you think traditional hospital occupancy is now? Last Wednesday, I went up to the University of Utah's cardiac intensive care to see a dear friend. And I was told by his daughter, who called me earlier that day when I'm taking care of my patients, if you don't go see Dad now, you won't see him alive. So I rushed up there to go see him, and just terrible physical condition, obviously on his way out, dying. Told him I loved him, held his hands for a few minutes, and then I left. What do you think is the average occupant? Now, the intensive care was full. That's part of the idea behind intensive care. I was told sometimes people are put into intensive care, not borderline whether they needed it or not, simply because they were well insured and the hospital needs the money. I mean, intensive care can be anywhere from $10,000 to $25,000 a day. So when they're talking about 7 years from now, we're going to have a hospital bed shortage because they're expecting hospital occupancy to exceed 85%. The rate of hospital admissions right now is 11% higher than what it was before this pandemic started, due simply to an aging, more medically complex population, they say. 10 years ago, hospital occupancy was 63%. Last year it was 75%. And in 7 years, greater than 85%, approaching 90% or higher. Now, instead of a national mobilization to build the needed capacity, what we're seeing across this country is increasing hospital closures and shortages of trained staff. And during the pandemic, there were shortages of trained staff and even the most basic of medical supplies. The report points to the success going on in China, where the 1,000-bed Hu-Shinshan Hospital was built in just 10 days during the pandemic. A 1,000-bed hospital built in 10 days when the pandemic started. Whereas the United States critical care capacity is dwindling, as financing is directed more towards building urgent care centers and ambulatory care facilities. The U.S. model is built on the false belief that low-cost facilities will offer more affordability and increase access to health care. But the report documents that no meaningful substitution occurs. So what's going on here? Well, people are getting sicker, needing more complex medical intervention than before. That's the issue. Yeah, the battle cry is we need more hospital beds, and we think that by 2032, more hospitals will be closing because they don't have beds. That's just what's on the surface. The reason is why. Why are they running out of beds? Because the occupancy rate is increasing, alarming figures. And why is that? Because we have an awful lot more people, especially in the elderly segment. I guess I would fall into that at 74. I'm thinking, 55 and older. My goodness, that was almost 20 years ago. They're getting sicker and sicker. Now, I've been very fortunate. I went through a coughing spell here a few minutes ago because I ate some stuff yesterday I shouldn't have eaten. I couldn't help it. It was too tempting in the presence of friends, and of course I did not want to be rude. So my body's responding to it. But other than that, I feel pretty good. I have a lot of people 10, 20 years younger than I am that I take care of that are in terrible shape. I've been very fortunate, been very blessed. I cannot remember the last time I was sick to the point where I couldn't do a radio show, and I'm, knock on wood here. But I take a lot of supplements. And I take what is essentially Jack's Pack for the immune system every day. And I also drink about 3 to 4 full glasses of raw milk every day. So I'm getting nature-made vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K, all coming through in that milk because those cows are out there eating green grass. So they're getting the vitamin K, and it ends up coming through in their milk. That's how new calves, before they ever start grazing on grass, get plenty of vitamin K. You don't see cows falling over on their side in pastures dying from blood hemorrhaging. All right, something else I wanted to mention here. I thought this was interesting. This is from JAMA Network. 1 in 15 U.S. adults have witnessed a mass shooting. Have you? I haven't. 1 in 15 people have witnessed a mass shooting, 7% of our population. Quoting here from JAMA. 1 in 15 adults has been physically present during mass shootings. The research has found that 2% of the U.S. adults have been injured by these events, meaning that they had been shot or hit by shrapnel or trampled by people fleeing the scene or suffered similar injuries. Now, the study was conducted by researchers at Colorado University in Boulder and found that the younger generation, the Gen Zs, which are adults born after 1996, was more likely to be exposed to the mass shootings than their parents or grandparents. I'm quoting here from David Pyruz, a professor of sociology and criminologist at the Institute for Behavioral Science at Colorado University in Boulder. This study confirms that mass shootings are not isolated tragedies, but rather reaches a substantial portion of the population with profound physical and psychological consequences. So the study defines mass shootings as an event in a public space where 4 or more people are shot, and uses the term physically present as being in a location where you could see the shooter or you could hear the gunfire. 1 in 7 people, or 1 in 15 people in a. Now, like I said, I don't know anybody, even, including myself, that has experienced that. But the numbers are increasing. So around midnight Saturday night, Secret Service was alerted to the presence of a vehicle parked about a block away from the White House in Washington. When officers approached the vehicle, the man brandished a firearm and shooting ensued. The suspect was injured by gunfire and taken to a hospital, but no officers were injured. The man and his vehicle matched the description of one described as a suicidal individual by police some days earlier, who warned that the man may be traveling to Washington, D.C. from Indiana. No other details or motive have been released. Trump was at Mar-a-Lago at the time of this event. It's being dismissed now by some circles as suicide by police. So I just threw that in there. I thought that was kind of interesting. These things don't stop. They continue on. I don't know how much time the president spends at Mar-a-Lago as opposed to the White House. I would think Mar-a-Lago would be much more comfortable. Well, panic is mounting in the Ukraine as the U.S. is cutting its intelligence sharing. Here's another move by Trump as a part of Trump's administration March 5th decision to suspend U.S. intelligence agencies sharing with the Ukraine. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency announced on the 7th that it has stopped providing Ukraine with satellite imagery. Now, what does that mean? I mean, where's that going? And this, the force follows the Trump-Putin phone call, where it was stated that they didn't discuss the Ukraine specifically. They were discussing security architecture and trade between the two countries, and at least opening up discussion between the leadership of both countries. But I can only see this as an attempt on the part of Trump to prove to Putin they want to end to this war, end to the massacre not only of the Ukrainian servicemen, but the Russians as well. Now, the Russians aren't being massacred like the Ukrainians are, but the Russians, what I've seen is 1 million deaths of the Ukrainian fighting people, and 100,000 Russians. Well, 100,000 is bad enough. That's almost, twice what we did in Vietnam over 10 years. But as part of this administration, they cut off satellite imagery to the Ukrainian fighting forces. And so since 2022, the National Geospatial Agency has provided Ukraine with electro-optical synthetic aperture radar imagery from multiple commercial remote sensing satellites. That's from Space News. It also says this is from the Washington Post. The Ukrainian military, artillery, and drone units in particular had heavily relied on the NGA service. Such intelligence had allowed Ukraine to use the U.S.-provided HIMARS systems to launch ATACMS, a longer-range U.S. guided missile system, and strike targets deep inside occupied Ukrainian territory or inside of Russia. An anonymous Ukrainian military officer said that the intelligence sharing pause will speed up the assault operations because the logistics can be much, much closer to the contact line. What does that mean? Well, that means that the Russian forces now don't have to worry about the Ukrainian forces being told the location of the Russian forces because of satellite information. The Ukrainians aren't getting it anymore. And they know they're up against a bigger fighter, or more armed force than the Ukrainians. And once you can't see where the enemy is anymore, what are you going to do? Yeah, you're going to turn and run. So, because this will speed up the assault operations, I love their verbiage here. In other words, it'll allow them to kill the Ukrainians faster. The expectation is that Russia is regenerating forces right now, and when the weather improves, they're going to increase the intensity of attacks, as you saw in the news last night. Time magazine is reporting, according to 5 senior Western and Ukrainian officials and military officers, the intelligence cut will increase casualties in the Ukraine. As a result of this pause, there are hundreds of dead Ukrainians. One of the officers told Time in an interview on Friday in Kyiv, asking not to be named when discussing sensitive military operations. The biggest problem is morale. He added, as the armed forces of Ukraine are being left to fight without some of the best weapon systems, not as a result of Russian attacks, but American pullbacks. It's really causing an advantage for the enemy on the front line. And then, of course, the Russians had this to say through Lavrov, that the halting of intelligence proved that without the West's direct involvement, Ukraine would not be able to launch long-range missiles at our territory. Yeah, well, now they know for sure. Now they know for sure where the intelligence was coming from that allowed the ATACMS missiles to be fired into Russia. Well, I've got one other thing here. This recent, and I'm getting this from Zero Hedge, this recent massacre of over 1,000 Alawite Christian men, women, and children. This is what the LaRouche organization said 10 years ago under Obama, when Obama was doing everything he could to get rid of Assad. And LaRouche was warning then, this is what will happen if you get rid of Assad. And not in defense of any dictatorial personality or behavior towards his own people that Assad may have been engendering, but a simple observation that as bad as the Assad government may have been in the view of some people, it kept genocidal action on the part of Islamist jihadists from happening. And now with Assad gone, and Al-Qaeda is now in charge, of course they're called differently, HTS now, still the same people. They just cut their hair, got rid of their bandana, shaved their beard, and put on a suit. Al-Jilani is Al-Jilani. So after several days of radical Sunni Islamist militants targeting the religious minorities in Syria for mass killings, mainly in coastal areas, the mainstream media has been belatedly starting to cover it as the killings are growing to the number where it's almost impossible to ignore. So some correspondents estimated that there are thousands of dead, mostly and wounded, mostly Alawites, but also Syrian Christians among them, as the post-Assad Syria unravels under HTS's Jolani. This is from the Associated Press. The death toll from 2 days of clashes between Syrian security forces and loyalists of ousted President Bashar Assad and revenge killings that followed has risen to more than 1,000. A war monitoring group said Saturday, making it one of the deadliest acts of violence since Syria's conflict began 14 years ago. 14 years ago would be 2011, which of course was under Obama, after they got rid of Gaddafi. Then they have to go after Assad. And why do they have to go after these people? Because these people, Gaddafi, like Hussein, wouldn't bow down to Western tyranny, wouldn't bow down to Western monetary policies or Western petroleum policies. They had this crazy idea that they had a responsibility to the sovereignty of their nation and to the welfare of their own citizens. Well, that just doesn't fit into the U.S. State Department. So these people had to go. And when they were getting rid of Assad, that's when LaRouche came out and said, you do that, you're going to have mass slaughter of the citizens. So the jihadists, which include foreign fighters as well as the ruling HTS members, in some cases are simply going to the homes of those who are non-Sunni and massacring whole families. And the terrorists haven't been shy about uploading their killings on the internet as well as in live streams. Men, women, children, even babies are being brutally murdered by HTS and the Al-Jilani crowd that we supported when they were just old Al-Qaeda fighters a number of years ago. You know, I saw this, I saw one of the Moses over the weekend. I just tired, got sat back on the couch, and one of my favorite versions of the Moses story is with Christian Bale. Exodus, Gods and Kings. And you may have seen it. And I really like it. And whether I'm seeing the Charlton Heston version or this one, and then there was another one here not too long ago, when the last plague hits the Egyptians, the angel of death comes through the community at night and kills the firstborn of the Egyptians, or anyone that does not have the blood of a sacrificed lamb on the lentil, the lentil, and I forget the exact biblical terminology, but the blood around the doorframe of their home, so that the angel of death will recognize that they're with the God of the Hebrews and will go after something else. And so the thought came into my mind when the HTS go into the homes of a non-Sunni, and how do they tell that it's a non-Sunni? You know, they don't have the blood of a sacrificed lamb over the doorway. But it's just like the angel of death. If they are non-Sunni, they massacre the whole family. Not just the firstborn, the whole family. Men, women, children, even babies being brutally murdered. So the Britain-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said in addition to 745 civilians killed, mostly in shootings from close distance, 125 government security force members and 148 militants with armed groups affiliated with Assad were killed. It added that electricity and drinking water were cut off in large areas around the city of Latakia. Now, instead of calling out the obvious ethno-religious genocide unfolding, the European Union had the audacity to say this. The European Union strongly condemns the recent attacks reportedly by pro-Assad elements on interim government forces in the coastal areas of Syria and all violence against civilians. The EU is saying that it's the pro-Assad people who are doing the killing. The witnesses are saying no, it's the Sunni arm of the HTS government that's doing the killing to all non-Sunnis, which mean any Arab group that's not Sunni, like Shia, better run for their lives. But the truth has been summarized by a priest of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is the predominant Christian faith of Syria and the Middle East. He said, Priest John Whiteford said this on X. As you see the unfolding tragedy in Syria, keep in mind this is your tax dollars at work. This was brought to you by the U.S. government, the State of Israel, and Turkey. They said Assad was bad. This is what they replaced Assad with. And there's gruesome, and I'm looking at all these videos here, most of them on X, of bodies piled up on the streets in and around Latakia. Some of them are just very disturbing. Now, Fox has underscored what Tulsi Gabbard said. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard's warning of a terrorist takeover in Syria looks to be coming true amid reports that al-Qaeda-linked terror forces aligned with Syria's interim new president, a former al-Qaeda terrorist, are being accused of massacring Alawites as well as members of the country's dwindling Christian community. So at Gabbard's Senate confirmation hearing, she said, "I have no love for Assad or any dictator. I just hate al-Qaeda. And I hate that our leaders cozy up to Islamist extremists, calling them rebels. As Jake Sullivan said to Hillary Clinton, al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. Syria is now controlled by al-Qaeda offshoot HTS, led by an Islamist jihadist who danced in the streets on 9/11 and who was responsible for the killing of many American soldiers." So far, Damascus has remained relatively quiet about this, but in areas where there are no media cameras, particularly the countryside areas of Syria, the jihadists are going on a murderous rampage, and sadly, it's going to get worse. Entire Alawite families have been massacred. I'm looking at pictures here. Meanwhile, Syrian Christians fear that they are next to be targeted on a large scale. Their warnings have largely fallen on deaf ears in the West. Do you think that they have the Second Amendment to protect themselves? As the Middle East Eye explains, quoting, the UK has lifted sanctions on 24 Syrian entities, including the central bank, in a landmark move that could be a turning point for Syria's devastated economy. Britain has become the first country to unfreeze all assets of the Central Bank of Syria. The state, airline, and state-owned oil companies are amongst other previously sanctioned entities removed from the sanctions list on Thursday afternoon. This approach underscores our commitment to help the people of Syria rebuild their country and economy, including through support for a Syrian-led and Syria-owned political transition process. We will continue to judge Syria's interim authorities by their actions, not their words, a UK government spokesperson said. We will continue to judge Syria's interim authorities by their action. Yeah, it's not so much that what they plan on doing for the benefit of Syria, it's the fact that they're killing Syrians. So the new Syrian government inherited this daunting economic crisis from Assad's government, which was toppled, I think it was last December. And government corruption, devastating conflict, crippling international sanctions have all contributed to wrecking Syria's economy under Assad. According to the UN, 9 out of 10 Syrians live in poverty. That wasn't the case under Assad. On December 17th, President Ahmed al-Sharaa, al-Qaeda codename Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, urged Britain and other countries to lift all the sanctions that have been imposed on the country under Assad. They should lift all restrictions which were imposed on the flogger and the victim. The flogger's gone now. This issue is not up for negotiation. So the UK's major policy shift could bring new opportunities for Syria if other nations follow suit. The Syrian government is led by the HTS, which remains a proscribed terrorist organization in the UK as well as here. As long as the US sanctions remain, the material impact of Britain's move will be limited. Britain wants to open up the doors to everything. But these barrel bombs, I don't know if you're familiar with them, they're just horrible things. Dropping them out of helicopters on civilians along the Syrian coast. I never imagined we'd be on the side dropping barrel bombs who had labeled Assad the barrel bomb regime. But there are videos on X. These barrel bombs, primarily incendiaries, like the poor man's napalm, launching them from helicopters. Just horrible. In the last few weeks, the government has launched extensive campaigns seeking to root out Assad loyalists from his former bastions. It's under further pressure in the southwest, where Israel has occupied a UN buffer zone and now commands the high ground looking over Damascus. Israel has also sought to portray itself as a protector of Syria's Druze, which is an ethno-religious minority in a bid to deepen its foothold in Syria. Now, the Druze are an interesting group of people. I think I've mentioned this before. They believe heavily in reincarnation. And they don't care if they're killed, because their belief in reincarnation is so strong that they will immediately be reincarnated to a better life than what they just left. And apparently living conditions are so bad that almost any reincarnated body would be an improvement. Now, last week, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu threatened military action to defend, mind you, a suburb 3 kilometers southeast of Damascus that is home to many Druze. You know, the fun just never ends. I'm sorry, that probably was uncalled for. But when you try to get an overall picture of what Trump is trying to achieve here, and the various factions that are fighting each other in the Middle East, in Europe, and what is going on in the House of Representatives, in the Senate in this country, and this fool of a federal judge that just said Trump can't stop this $2 billion expenditure through U.S. aid, when the Constitution is very clear that all executive power is placed in the President of the United States. Not some of it, all of it is. And when you look at where this money is coming out of, it's not coming out of the legislative body, these expenditures. It's not coming out of the Supreme Court. It's coming out of the executive, offices under the executive, and that all power is in President Trump or President Biden or whoever was there before we got in there, whoever got in there. I suspect that'll be taken to the Supreme Court very quickly, and the Supreme Court will overturn it. There's a fellow who, I don't even think he's been in the office for a year, put in there by Biden as a federal judge in Washington. And you see all these little things that try to disrupt the action of Trump, who I honestly believe in my heart of hearts is very much in favor of peace. He really wants peace. There's no argument. And so with the U.S. cutting off information sharing and military supplies to the UK or to the Ukraine, leaving Ukraine practically with a very short period of time where they could, in any case, maintain any kind of military activity. This is really a very incredibly important moment. And if you then compare the hysterical behavior of some of the people in Europe, I think it's now getting very clear who is interested in keeping this war going and who wants peace. And this is what I was saying a little bit earlier. When you look at it, it kind of breaks down into two groups. There's the group who really wants international security architecture and world peace, and those who want war at any cost. I suspect largely financed by the military-industrial complex. It's very difficult for MIC stocks to make any money during peace times. But the cost. So I think, there's a principle here. With what if it's applied for a good purpose, will really bring the world away from the edge of World War III. Now, there are those who are spreading the rumor that Trump might announce that the U.S. is leaving NATO as early as this week in response to the Starmer-Macron meeting, and that they had a decidedly negative reaction to the Europeans because they came out and said they don't want peace, they're committed to war. So you have two questions. What's the chances of the U.S. leaving NATO? And if they did, can NATO survive without the United States? Now, is the view of many people that I would consider in the know for a very long time that NATO should have been dissolved at the same time when the Warsaw Pact dissolved in 1991. And also the character of NATO in the meantime has changed increasingly step by step from a supposedly intentional defensive North Atlantic alliance into an offensive alliance with global aspirations of moving to global China or global Pacific. NATO, Pacific NATO, Now, I do think that NATO should dissolve. There's no issue about that in my mind. I think it's an absolute obsolete concept. I think it would be good if the United States would make that decision as well, and I don't think that NATO alone can maintain something like NATO. Europe can't. They may be able to develop a European security system, but I personally think that that would be a completely missed opportunity, because I think we're at a point where we have to go into the new paradigm of international relations, whereby geopolitics is being replaced by a cooperative approach. Rather than bomb them if they won't give us their natural resources, let's combine our businesses and our efforts and our strategy and our intelligence to find a way that we can all benefit from this. And given the fact that there are now two major players, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, talking about a global security system and global civilizational initiative, and Putin in his last meeting last Saturday with the FSB basically said that he now sees the possibility to establish a European security system and even a global security system. So I think anybody in the West who wants to have a different outlook should immediately pick up on that and start serious negotiations along these lines. Because the very idea that you always need an enemy is just, I mean, it's one of these ideas that, I mean, in German, those backward ideas of the past should be rooted out. And humanity would make a new leap into an area of cooperation. I think anybody of goodwill would help work in this particular direction, to cry peace, to work peace, rather than spreading France's European or nuclear umbrella all over Europe. Now, I think the realities of this war, the Ukrainian war, which are horrible, but I think Trump absolutely wants peace there. That's the first and most important thing that needs to be done. But eventually one has to look back at who prevented the peace back in March of 2022, 3 years ago this month. I mean, there's obviously the whole question of how did it come to the war in the first place? And there are many important Americans in particular who have pointed to the whole development of NATO expansion and broken promises. Excuse me, Jack Matlock, Jeffrey Sachs, Wertheimer, all kinds of people of relevance have pointed to this. And I think if everything is under control, which hopefully it soon will be, one has to look back and say who is responsible for the agreement that was reached in Turkey, in Istanbul, in March 3 years ago, where there was an agreement between Putin and Zelenski who sabotaged this. And now there are more and more people coming forward saying it was Biden. And it was emphatically Boris Johnson flying into Kyiv, telling Zelensky to keep fighting because we're backing you all the way. So all the people who've died since, this is hundreds of thousands of people. Nobody knows for sure how many, but probably more than 500,000 dead and almost that many disabled. And the whole country's destroyed, the infrastructure's destroyed. This last attack against power centers, electrical power, and for what? For what? Ukraine's only a shadow of what it was before. For what? And the only reality has to come, these people have to come to their senses and basically say that in modern times, war is not a way to settle conflict. Now, President Trump spoke of a missile defense system, calling it the Golden Dome to protect the United States, referring to Reagan's call for the missile defense system as the Strategic Defense Initiative. And I think what one can adduce from what Trump said in this speech, what exactly he means, because it's not very clear. He referred on the one side to Reagan's policies of the 1980s. And that indeed would indicate something like the SDI, but about the SDI there was so much misunderstanding. And there was this far-reaching vision as to how to dissolve the blocs, how to dissolve the Warsaw Pact and NATO, how to move with mutually assured destruction to mutually assured survival. And it was the joint cooperation between Russia and NATO, or the United States in particular, to develop the technologies which could lead to and make strategic weapons disappear, obsolete. And then use the application of these new physical principles, which would have been gained, to apply that in the civilian sector, and then use the incredible boost of productivity to make a technology transfer to the developing countries to overcome their underdevelopment for good, to stop treating these countries in proxy wars, but give them a chance to fully develop to their potential. So it's probably too early to comment on this because the remarks of Trump were too scarce to know whether he meant the SDI as it was picked up by President Reagan, or did he mean Golden Dome, referring to Israel's Iron Dome? I think there's definitely a very interesting question here, but it kind of has to be sorted out, and one would hope that it would be the Reagan version, but we have to see. And while all of that is going on, and the threat of warfare and the threat of thermonuclear extinction of mankind, there's also talk to some of the Europeans that are going on. They foam at the mouth when you mention the word Russia, and it's unbelievable how this Russophobia has taken over. But if Trump on the other side goes in the direction of making lasting, far-reaching agreements with Russia, then there's obviously an implication that Russia and China have a strategic partnership, which I don't think anybody is ever going to split again. And I mean, there's, Steve Bannon and Pompeo running around in Europe at the time of the Biden administration telling leading Europeans, we will split Russia from China. That's how we will defeat this whole thing. Well, I don't think that's going to happen, because I think both the governments of Russia and China, they know perfectly well that if they're divided, then they're vulnerable to attack. So I think it's almost 100% that any attempt to separate them will not work. Furthermore, you have the BRICS as this new dynamic, the global majority, which is the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, all want development. They have experienced colonialism. They have experienced their natural resources stolen from them by the Western powers. Vietnam has experienced war, Agent War in other countries, Agent Orange. Other countries in Africa have developed coups, murders of their leaders. I mean, this is all very present in their memory, and I don't think they're going to be convinced to ally with any scheme that would go against either Russia or China, because these countries are right now bending over backwards to help them. So therefore, if Trump wants to deal with all of that in a positive way, he has to take China into the package, because China has provided many of these countries in the global south with real development, and they have, as a result, become friends. So I think the best thing that could happen, which has been said for a long time now, if the European countries and the United States would give up their geopolitical fantasies and basically say we're moving from confrontation to cooperation, then a new deal would be very easy. It'd just be simply a piece of cake, a new paradigm, a completely new paradigm. And that would spread. That would spread over the whole face of the earth, which is something that gives me a lot of hope. And one of the policies that's still hovering, especially among the Arab leagues, is the Oasis plan. They really like this. Netanyahu doesn't like the Oasis plan because Netanyahu does not want a two-state solution. I think the Egyptian plan is a very good proposal, counter-proposal, to what President Trump has proposed with his Riviera Gaza idea, which is pretty outrageous, especially if you think about the AI-generated video which is circulating out there. He put it on his own channel, which is disgusting, really. So the Egyptian plan is definitely a step in the right direction. It says a two-state solution. It says the Palestinians would remain there for the time of the reconstruction, when the plan will take about 5 years, and it has a detailed approach of separating the Gaza into different zones for different centers. And it all looks very good. It's all very realizable. But it's a far cry from the Oasis plan, because the Oasis plan basically has this idea of water by generating large, large amounts of fresh water from ocean water by desalination. And then the canals from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea and the Red Sea, just the beginning. If you think about the Oasis plan in that context of the Belt and Road Initiative, for all of Southwest Asia, one has to think about the entire region from India to the Mediterranean, from the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf. Mainly desert, almost entirely desert, completely lacking water. And the Oasis plan is basically a concept for how to turn this desert into land for agriculture, forestry, infrastructure, city building. I mean, so much larger conception. I mean, just think about this. If you were given if you had this initiative in your head to take some large swath of land between Utah and Nevada borders and to turn it into a very productive area in the sense of increased population, increased infrastructure, architecture. Maybe there was some vast reserve discovered there that would employ 100,000 people. And you looked at this area and what you see is desert. You may have to look miles before you see anything green. What's the first thing you have to make sure of if you're going to be a part of this revitalization and bringing life to this area of the Utah-Nevada border? Yes, of course, water. Millions of acre feet of water. Where are you going to get it? Because you can't do this stuff without water. The thing I hear from some of my patients that are employed by city governments around the county, with all of these multi-unit buildings going up. I mean, just across the street from where I'm living, across the freeway, I think there's 5 of these in a row, all adjacent to one another, with a 2-lane road coming out of their parking areas onto Bangerter. And where's the water coming from for these people? Not that we shouldn't have something like this, but where is the water coming from? And we shouldn't have something like this if we don't have the water. Well, that's what the Oasis Plan is about. Massive desalination along the Red Sea coast, along the coast of the Mediterranean, pumping huge amounts of water uphill into an area where it can be reservoired and then distributed from that through various canals and waterways and riverways to turn the desert into a rose. Or on the other hand, you just go on killing the men, women, and children who are in Palestine till they're all gone, and then you can go in and build your Riviera. I think the way Trump talks about this stuff is just the plan, the deal. You go in and you make some outrageous requirement of what you want. He's done it with the tariffs. Look at the pause now on the Mexican tariff because he's getting what he wants. You go out and you make some big outrageous plan. Well, we'll just take over the Gaza and we'll clean it out and we'll turn it into a Riviera. Well, he knows exactly how the Arabs are going to respond to that. But he says these things so he can get a counter proposal from the Arabs. And the Arab League just got through meeting, and they have a rebuilding program of 3 to 5 years for the Gaza that makes a lot of sense. It's not as good as the Oasis Plan, but it makes a lot of sense where the Palestinians would not have to leave. Well, I think the idea of the Oasis Plan is very alive and has a real definite future as they try to come to some understanding of what is going on in the Middle East. A never-ending trick, that's for sure. So I'm going to stop the recording here at K-Talk, and I will save that. And then I will bring the stream to an end. I hope this has been valuable, for some of you. I still am going to break this into smaller sections. I'm still going to do maybe 20, 30-minute sections. I just got to figure out a way how I can coordinate it with the radio station and the stream at the same time. So I'm going to end the stream. Thank you for paying attention.